Thank you. Thank you, Moritz, for the nice introduction. And I wish to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's been really a pleasure to visit your labs and be in the sports university. As Moritz said in the introduction, then I work with a variety of populations. And lately, especially in Finland, I have been working a lot more with the elderly and how strength training can return function. But this is kind of getting back to my first love, which is sport and performance. So this is really, really nice. And thank you all for coming as well. I understand that's English, and you have to deal with my English. So it's from Newcastle to living 13 years in Finland. I don't even know where my accent is from anymore, somewhere in the North Sea, perhaps, but I hope that it's all clear for you. So the title of my talk today is focused on acute responses, so what happens with one single strength training session, and chronic adaptations, so when we put many of these eccentric overload strength training sessions together, what happens to the system? Just before I start, I worked with Moritz in Jyväskylä when he did his PhD, and of course I happened to mention a few times something about German efficiency. And so when we were in communications for the conference, I sent this type of email to Moritz, to which he responded that. So you really just get to the point. So I'll try to speed up my, my speech for this presentation. And what we're going to do today, we're going to have theory on the slides, but as you can see, we've got the Smith machine here. So we're going to have some practical demonstrations to show you whether the theory holds true when you do it with your athletes. And we have two volunteers. We have Alina and we have Niels. So if you would like to welcome them to the stage, please. And this is really nice because the pressure's not on me, it's on them. They have to perform. You guys can start with your warm-up. So what is concentric eccentric overload or eccentric overload? Well, it's kind of simple. It's just that we are using a greater load during the eccentric phase of the action compared to the load that we're using on the concentric phase. But of course, in science, we have to complicate things. So some people have called it enhanced eccentric resistance, some people additional eccentric load, and abbreviated AEL. And the Americans tend to favor accentuated eccentric load. So if you're reading the papers and they are from America, you'll essentially be reading about accentuated eccentric load. And if you read the papers from Europe, you will be typically reading about eccentric overload. But they are exactly the same thing. And they differ from the eccentric only method when you are just performing eccentric actions, not followed by the concentric action. And the rationale for doing this is pretty straightforward. We have the force-velocity relationship, which governs that for any given velocity, we are much stronger. We are able to produce a lot more force eccentrically than concentrically. So when we're training, typically in the gym with our athletes, the load that we got on the bar, the intensity, is limited by our ability to produce concentric force. So there could be some reserve here that we can tap into and get a greater training stimulus. Can you play the first video, please? In the top left-hand corner, this is a machine that's been developed in Innsbruck at the Austrian Institute of Sport. It's pretty expensive. It was developed for eccentric-only training, but they have made some software modifications, and what you can actually do with the bars is you can program how much force they lift. So you can essentially take off some of this load that the athlete has to lift with. This is Tom, he's an alpine skier, lifting 225 in the squat, and his 1RM was somewhere in the region of 195, 197 and a half. The next one, there's another one in Salzburg I hear, but the Austrians have this really kind of expensive. Inexpensive option to perform eccentric overload is the flywheel. These cost about 2,000 euros. This is somewhere like 35,000 euros. But one issue that you have with this is that you can't quantify exactly what you're doing in the eccentric phase. And it will differ between reps. It will differ between people, because it's how you perform the concentric phase which governs how the inertia on the eccentric phase is. So this is kind of easily implemented, but we can't quantify what you're actually doing. And it requires a lot of practice and familiarization. Since Nokia went bust, we don't have any money in Finland, so we use simple equipment, and these are what we're going to use today. So these are the weight releasers, and as you can see, we load the bar, and in this case we have 40% of the concentric load on the weight releasers. So the person is lifting around 70 to 80% of 1 RM, then we put on an additional 40% load, and it comes off at the bottom. And of course, you need your spotters who are able to assist during this training. Go on to the next video. And if we want to do single joint exercises, it's possible. All I have done here is extended the pin of the weight stack, and you have a monkey lifting the weight and lowering the weight. And this is a study that I will talk about later in my presentation. So this is what the overall structure of the presentation. First, we will talk about maximum strength and power, how one session of eccentric overload may influence maximum strength performance, how one session may affect power performance, and then we're going to look at some studies on chronic effects of using this method. And then in the second half, we move over to hypertrophic type training. This is moderate loads, 60 to 80% 1 RM, 8 to 12 reps, bodybuilding type of training. And we're going to look at there what happens in your hormonal response, what happens in terms of neuromuscular fatigue that the single session induces, and then what happens when you do this long term. You guys are all set? Okay. A couple more slides and then we'll get to some action. The method's been around for a while, but really there was a couple of papers in 2002 that sort of kicked off researcher interest, and the Dawn paper was one of them. They used the weight releasers in weight training experienced men. But you can see the loads used, they were approximately 80 kilograms in body mass, and they're lifting around 100 kilograms. So they're not really impressive. They're not athletes. They are like me, kind of. But here, what they did was they used 105% of the 1 RM load on the eccentric phase, and then lifted or tried to attain their 1 RM. And they saw that it actually enhanced their 1 RM acutely. So this eccentric 5% extra load made them get a better 1 RM performance. This was followed up a few years later in our lab, and we used the same 105% as here, and then tried 110% and 120. But in each case, we actually got a reduction in the 1 RM performance. So in this study, it had an acute enhancement, and in this study, it had an acute reduction in 1 RM performance. This is the scientific studies that we have at the moment, totally conflicting results. But one thing that does seem to be consistently observed is this phenomenon. So when we use lighter loads and we're looking for power, velocity, any kind of explosive action, we seem to get an acute enhancement of power. What they did here was they had 40 kilograms on the bar in both eccentric and concentric, and they measured the height of the bar that the athlete could throw. So it's an explosive bench throw. And then they tried 60% on the bar in the eccentric phase, and again 40 kilograms on the concentric, 70 eccentric to 40, 80 to 40. And in all cases, we have an acute enhancement of a couple of centimeters. And we're going to demonstrate and we're going to reproduce this study right now. So yeah, let's go with Niels first. And Niels will do exactly this. So he's going to do 40-40, and we're going to compare that to 60-40. And then with Alena, we're going to modify the actual loads for her strength level. So yeah, you can change, and we'll go 40. So we've got 40 kilos there for Niels, and he's going to do 3 singles, and he's just going to try to throw the bar as high as possible. So very explosive action and maximal performance. You can cheer, you can shout, you can motivate, there's no problem. I really want that because he has to perform maximally now, otherwise 200 people are disappointed. Come on, Niels, come on. All right, fast, on time, do it. Oops. And again. And again, one more. Maximum. Okay, so quite stable baseline. This is the software that we'll use. You have it here in your institute. And what we are looking at, if you know your Spanish, what we're looking at is here. This is the height that the bar has traveled. So we're looking, the highest is there, 71.79 centimeters. So that's the benchmark. Okay. Now we're going to move to Alena. Okay, and she's going to do with the bar, so it's 20 kilograms for her. And exactly the same thing. It's going to be 3 single reps, throw the bar as high as possible. This is our baseline. Okay, when you're ready, you may begin. Fast. Whoop! Come on. And again. Whoop! We want a new record for you. Oh, good, good. Whoop! Nice. What did we get? So the highest was the third one. Well done. 58.6. That's completely different than what we... you were really motivated for the last one. We were getting these 55s and things last time. Good. So that's going to be quite difficult for you to beat. But this is what we're going to do. So for Niels, we're now going to put the 10s back on. And I've got 20 kilos here loaded on the weight releaser. So he's going to lower 60. The weight releaser will pop off, and he will throw 40. And we'll see what we got. And it was 77.7 centimeters, was it? If I remember badly. $71.7, sorry. Okay, 71.7. So that's what we got to beat for the theory to hold, okay? So maximum effort. Come on, don't let me down. Come on. You ready? Go. Whoop! And again, come on, fast. Whoop! And again. Whoop! Now I'm nervous. 74, yes. Round of applause for Niels. And we're going to do the same for Elena, but now I got 5 kilos on the weight releaser. And now a new record for you too. Come on. You can do it. 3 singles. You ready? And go. Whoop! Yep. And again. Whoop! Fast. Let's throw this thing. Come on. You can do it. Whoop! Nice. Okay. And how did it go? It was, she got a really new record, was the 58, because she's been hitting 55s. So, yeah. And now we got 57. Okay, so this was a little bit kind of same, a little bit lower. Okay, good. So her kind of stable baseline was 55, and then she got that great 58, and then we had kind of 57, 57, and stuff like that. Okay, so you can see that now in practice. You can switch maybe. In practice, Niels, who's trained man, we replicated the study, exactly the same happened. Now we have a little bit different population. Elena, she's done some resistance training, she's a woman. We modified the loads. So this was 50% of what was on the bar. Now we had 25% of what was on the bar. So it's highly individual, and you may need to modify your loading strategies for your individual subjects. It seems very consistent. This 60-40 seems to work well in men who have resistance training background. With females or with more trained or less trained people, you may need to find exactly the individual responses. This was hiding, I think. Now we're back. Okay, and it's not just in bench press. Oh, it needs to be full screen, I think. How do we get there? I don't know. It's not the full screen shot. How do we get that? Ah.
How you have done before?
Don't know. It just went before. Does somebody who can speak German know how to do these things? But so I'll keep talking while somebody figures out this. But it doesn't just happen in bench press. Jeremy Shepherd's group from Australia have reproduced this in jumping, especially in volleyball players. So what they did here, they had 20-kilogram dumbbells in their hands, lowered it slowly, dropped the dumbbell, and then performed the jump. Ooh. Cool, thank you. And then perform the jump. And you can see that even in highly trained volleyball players who are jumping around about the 50 centimeters in a counter movement jump can still get acute enhancement of a few centimeters. And this is all great that it's happening in the single session. But what we really want to know is whether it happens when you start training like this. And we've had few studies that have looked at utilizing this acute enhancement of power through eccentric overload in long-term training. But it was really popular with Shepherd's group. And in the men, on the left-hand side, this was their loading paradigm. This black bar is the eccentric overload group, and you can see the improvement in their unloaded counter-movement jump performance. So they just performed a typical counter-movement jump. There was a significant increase in their performance. Whereas the other group, who were just doing the body weight counter-movement jumps, saw no change. They did it in women, changed the loading, so 10-kilogram dumbbells rather than 20, but the same number of reps, same number of sets. And again, this assisted or eccentric overload group saw the greatest improvements. So in terms of power, in low load, high velocity actions, this seems to hold in training also. You get a benefit. But I heard that the crowd is a mixture of sports science students and coaches. Is that correct? So if you're a coach, can you put your hand up? Okay. Now, yeah, keep your hands up a minute. It won't take long. So now what I would say to the sports science students is here. Look at the design. You have two groups, and this group did exactly the same as what they've always done. And this group did something else. And it's the same here. There's a different stimulus. So all people with their hands up who are coaches, keep your hands up. So all the sports science student guys, they can turn around to the ones with their hands in the air and say, we cannot say that this was due to the eccentric overload. Because the design of the study just says that they did something else and they got a better result. And anybody with your hand in the air, you can turn to those guys who don't have their hands and say, I don't care. It worked. They got better. So we have to have the mix between the coaches and the scientists. We can communicate. But it seems to hold, and it's quite robust for power, at least. This was done in Germany, actually, Friedman Bet, 2010, and they did with knee extensions. They did quite a high volume, and you can see here the loading was really quite high. So an extra 90% of the load on the eccentric phase. And they performed the reps as fast as possible. They had a special mechanical device, which I haven't seen, actually. And then the squat jump performance, which is, okay, so the strength is at the top, this concentric 1RM. Both groups got an improvement. They improved their strength. But down here, where's my little square? There it is. Only the eccentric overload group improved their squat jump performance, so the power performance. This seems to be good, as I said, for the high velocity, low load power. Okay, now we move to more kind of bodybuilding type, and we look at what happens with the acute fatigue and the acute hormonal responses. So here we have three sets. They did 3 sets for the eccentric overload, and in the normal traditional group they did 4 sets. So a lot of the studies out there, they try to equalize the volume and the total work by dropping a set from the eccentric overload group. And they looked at the hormonal responses. So it seems that in this solid line, the eccentric overload group got a greater increase in circulating testosterone compared to the traditional group, even though the traditional group did more sets, they did more volume. And then again, in the Ojasto and Häkkinen papers from our lab, this time they did 4 times 10 on the bench press, and they looked at growth hormone, which is again, the responses are related to the intensity and the volume of the strength training session. And this means that the 70% was the percent of 1RM in the concentric phase, and this 70, 80, 90, 100 was the load during the eccentric phase. So this is the sort of benchmark. And when you add an extra 10% of eccentric load, we get a little bit of higher response. When you add 20% extra, you get a greater response, and then this 100 seems to be maybe a little bit too tough. And what they did was they showed you the number of repetitions that were successful voluntarily. So we tried for 40, but how many did the subject actually perform themselves? In these conditions, they were both 35. And then once you get to 90, there was a reduction, so 33 successful repetitions. And then when you get to 100, there's only 30. So we're reducing the volume here, which may then go on and affect this. But there's some kind of place, some kind of combination of intensity of the eccentric training, the eccentric load, that will enhance your acute hormonal response. And this is an indicative of your neuromuscular fatigue. And we're going to do a fatigue test, kind of test with Niels. So we're going to load 80 on the bar. Yeah, let's go with that. Put the put a 5 and a 2.5. Yeah. It's not quite in. And then. Okay, so you're going to aim for 10 reps with this slow, controlled bodybuilding type action. So 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds up and 1.5, 2 seconds down. And you're going to just, this is 80, about 1 kilo off. So now this is the normal condition. Yeah. Approximately 75% of his 1RM load. Doing good. Keep going. Easy. Well done. Okay, we'll give you a couple minutes rest, and then you're going to do exactly the same, but this time in the eccentric phase, you're going to do 40% of what you got on the bar. Okay, and let's see, what was the... Did you have his last velocity? Just to mention for yours. That's no problem if not. 0.32. Okay, so the velocity, even though I asked him to keep a steady pace, okay, he's got up typically around 0.45 meters per second, and then it starts to come down to 0.32. Okay, this will become more apparent in Fernando's demonstration, but the last one was 0.327. Okay. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing again. You feel okay? Was that 2 minutes rest? 1 minute. It was 1 minute? Oh, you have it on the clock. Good. Just 1 minute? That's it? Oh, I'm so impatient. Okay, we'll give you 2 minutes. Bodybuilding type training. How many repetitions, if I said with that load, just keep going until failure, how many reps do you think you could do? 15. Maybe 15? Yeah, a few more. Yeah, that's probably somewhere close. Yeah. Okay. So with that load, he had about 5 reps in reserve. Now he's strong enough for this, for the eccentric phase, no problem. And he's strong enough for the concentric phase. But we'll see how the combination of the two will affect this set. Okay. So do exactly the same again. Slow, controlled, every rep, go to 10 reps. And I'll get my workout as well. Okay, ready? Yeah. Yeah. There's 3. It's going well. Yeah, going good. Oh, that's it. Come on. Keep going. Keep going. How many is that? 7. Come on. Keep going. All right. Go, 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 go. And again. One more. Up it goes. Yeah. All right. Round of applause, please. Good. Okay, so he did 9 reps on that one, and his final velocity was 0.22. Okay, so it's getting pretty close to that that really, really final rep. So you maybe had 1 or 2 reps in reserve? For you 2. For me 2? For anyone else, just 1? Sounds good. So we can see by doing that, we've created a greater level of neuromuscular fatigue. He's just done 1 set and he's wrecked. You imagine doing 3 sets. So this then leads to those hormonal responses that I just showed you. You'll get a greater hormonal response. Change, please. Yeah. So in practice, you can, with your athletes, think about it like, do you want to make them work harder? Or can you reduce the volume of their training and still get the same response? So if they are those kind of athletes that train multiple different elements of fitness, and you don't want to have that the strength training affects some other training, subsequent training that you have, then you can reduce the total volume. Maybe 2 or 3 sets is enough instead of 5 sets. And you still get the same response because it's more challenging for the neuromuscular system. Something that you can play around with in your programming. This was from our study that we did with the leg press and the knee extension that I showed you. So far, or before this study, which we published in 2017, they were just one-shot studies. So you get people in the lab, what happens when you do this, what happens when you do this. Now we had a 10-week training program, and we did the loading, the 1 session We tested it at week 2 during their training, and we tested it also at week 8 during their training. In terms of cortisol, which is not the bad guy, we want cortisol in the acute setting to kickstart the adaptation process. In week 2, it goes up in both the traditional in the blue and the eccentric overload group in the red. So there's an acute increase approximately 15 to 30 minutes after the strength training session. Then 6 weeks later, so at week 8, coming towards the end of the mesocycle, statistically there's no increase in the traditional group, whereas there is in the eccentric overload group. But physiologically, come on, there's no difference here. But if we look at growth hormone, again we have large increases in both, so the traditional group and the eccentric overload group at week 2. But at week 8, you can see there's a huge and statistically significant difference in the growth hormone response 15 to 30 minutes after the training session, with a greater response in eccentric overload. And I would take this to sort of suggest that that training stimulus, what we did, which was 3 sets of 10 on the leg press, followed by 3 sets of 10 on the knee extension, that it's no longer stimulating these guys. They have to do something. They have to change the training program. But it's so tough that these guys are still stimulated by that training program. What happens when we put it into the long-term development? You know what this is? It's motor unit synchronization. No, I don't know how it translates. It's a bad joke. Don't worry about it. So what's the training evidence for this? I've shown acutely it happens, with power it happens, but now we want strength and we want muscle mass. What evidence do we have to say that this is successful? This was one of the first studies by Kaminsky in the 90s. And again, well, actually, it goes for both the coaches and the sports scientists. Now, what I really want you to look at is what is the methods that they have used, because that really shows you why they got the results that they got. So you've got to inspect the methods. We have 23-year-olds. They are students. They are non-trained. They have never seen a gym before in their life. This guy got them in, and he got them to do 2 sets of 8 reps, 80% of 1 RM. Then he got these guys to do the eccentric overload group, 2 sets, 8 reps, and they used 100% of 1 RM on the eccentric, and they used 40% on the concentric. And they got increases in strength in both groups, and the groups did not differ. How you find any differences in the training programs when you use these subjects with this loading protocol? Everyone's going to improve. So don't just look at the results and say, it's all the same. Look at what they did. So we can throw away Kaminsky et al. Sorry. Nichols did it also in the mid-90s, and this time he used 67-year-olds. They did the typical equalizing the total volume, so the normal group, which he called CE, versus the eccentric overload group, which he called GE. They did a different number of sets. And this was his loading protocol. So he actually used different types of eccentric overload. This was the normal 45 to 60% of 1 RM in both concentric and eccentric. And then he used 25 to 40% greater load in the eccentric phase, which is what I've just done with Niels, this 40%. And in the seated row exercise, he got no difference between the GE and the CE groups. So it was equally effective. But the shoulder press, there was a seemingly advantage for the eccentric overload group. But again, now we've got 67-year-olds, never seen a gym. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And this is really the evidence that we've got. So how do we, I got some graphics. So how do we advise you as coaches to do it with your athletes who are well trained? And this was the other one, the other paper that I mentioned about this 2002 year being kind of seminal to kickstart our interest. And they used strength athletes. Again, they equalized or tried to equalize the total work, the volume load, by taking away a set for this eccentric overload group. You can see how confusing it is because now it's called DAER, it's eccentric overload. And they used this kind of loading paradigm. So they went 50% more because they had 120. In the elbow flexors, on the left, there doesn't seem to be any difference. But on the right, in the elbow extensors, we start to see this portioning out of the response. This was a 9-week training study. So for some muscle groups, in some individuals, the older literature seems that it might work. And so we weren't convinced with this, and we wanted to do the study that I showed you. So 3 sets of 10 reps, leg press, 3 sets of knee extension, single leg. You can hopefully see in the picture, this guy has seen a gym. He's got quite good muscle mass. He's a strength-trained guy. We did not want to equalize the total work from the get-go. We wanted them to, both groups do 3 sets of 10 reps. We're not trying to equalize anything. And we pair matched the group or in terms of 3. So we tested them first. What's your maximal strength? What's your muscle size? And who are the closest 3? And then we randomized them to traditional in the blue, to eccentric overload in the red, or to control. So the control group here, the C group, they just did their own training program, and we didn't care about them. We didn't follow them up. What we did in this study, so what I said before about that, the design, now the traditional group, they came to us. And they did it every session with us standing there, screaming at them, feeding them some protein after the training session. And the eccentric overload group, they came here and I screamed at them and I fed them protein again. And the only thing differed was the eccentric load. So this is a 3-group study. So this is the kind of true study to say, was it the eccentric overload that did it or not? Eccentric torque, the absolute values on the left-hand side of the figure here, only the eccentric overload group improved. And you can see the relative change here in percentage over the 10 weeks. And of course, the eccentric force in the eccentric overload group improved the most. And that was kind of what you would expect, training specificity. What about other contraction types? Well, the concentric phase, okay. They're using exactly the same load as the other group. Increases in the traditional group, increases in the eccentric overload group, and these become statistically significant compared with the guys who didn't get screamed at. And it's pretty much the same here. So this doesn't disadvantage people from improving their strength in the concentric phase, and it gives advantage for eccentric. How about a non-training specific test of maximal strength? So we did with isometric torque. And now, at 5 weeks, I brought this in, this mid-training, this is after 5 weeks. Both groups improved, the traditional versus the eccentric overload. Both groups improved in isometric force. Then the traditional group, they plateaued out. They didn't see any more improvements after 5 weeks. Do you remember what happened in the hormones, in growth hormone? They went up at week 2, at week 8, they didn't see a response. And I said that it's not stimulating anymore. And it gives me confidence that this is actually happening, because from 5 to 10 in the eccentric overload group, they get another increase in their isometric force. And this is much better compared with control. So it seems that you can do this for a longer period because it is so tiring, it is so stimulating. But I have to say, one thing which I haven't been able to really answer is whether the guys here at the eccentric overload guys here are so sore that this actually would not be here. So I said that it's a further increase, but it could be that they are so sore and stiff and kind of blasted in the first 5 weeks that they can't really perform their potential. So this is something that you have to, as a coach, be aware of in your athletes. This will really kill them. They can't get to the toilet. I mean, So the first few weeks, you may need to somehow progressively ease this in. Otherwise, it may have consequences to the other training. So everything looks good for strength. And what explains that increase in strength? We did some neural stimulation techniques. And this technique tells us how well that the nervous system can activate the muscles. So this is the interpolated twitch technique. And after 10 weeks, the eccentric overload group saw the increase. And you can see it here in percentage change. So what's driving this greater increase in isometric strength seems to be muscle activation. So it's the nervous system. You saw how it was difficult. We don't let the eccentric phase rest. The nervous system still needs to drive the contraction, and it's probably explaining the increases in strength. You can get more out of your machine. It's a Mercedes-Benz versus a Fiat, Moritz. So when you buy a Fiat. How about muscle mass? We've got strength. How about muscle mass? Remember the Friedman-Bett study? Where they performed this as fast as possible, and now they took biopsies. So we have type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. And the type 2X is the fastest fibers, the strongest fibers. And you usually lose those if you do typical bodybuilding type exercise. But actually here in this study, those were the ones that hypertrophied. So we've got similar hypertrophy here on a gross, the whole muscle level. It's the same between these two groups. But here, it's the faster, the more athletic type of fibers that hypertrophied with the eccentric overload. And you become a faster phenotype. So definitely important for athletic performance. Bent, this is how I assume everybody in Sweden trains. You're smiling and everything's happy. It doesn't happen like that in Finland, where it's cold and dark and crap. We don't smile. And this is using a flywheel. And they have somewhat greater, this is flywheel versus weight stack, and somewhat greater increase in muscle hypertrophy with these methods. In our study, we didn't see that. We used this ultrasound, so this is an extended field of view ultrasound. You slide it across the surface, and it takes picture after picture after picture, and it makes a whole image like this, and we can trace around the, in this case, vastus lateralis. This is rectus, and we took it at 3 different portions along the thigh in this study: 33%, 50%, and 67% of the length of the femur. And between the traditional and the eccentric overload group, we saw increases in both groups. We got hypertrophy, but there's no real difference. So strength was greater, but the hypertrophy wasn't anymore using this eccentric overload method. Just to quickly point out, this was not eccentric overload, this was concentric only or eccentric only, and there may be regional differences. So the black is the eccentric. It might be that at more distal portions you get greater hypertrophy, whereas with concentric only you may get mid-portion greater hypertrophy. So look to the methods again. That's why we did this with 3 regions. But some studies only pick 50%. So be careful with that, how you extrapolate the results. And this, I don't expect that you read all of this. Don't worry about that. This is just a recent meta-analysis. This is flywheel versus traditional. And what they have here is they have maximal strength at the top, and how many studies have investigated maximal strength. This is muscle power, and how many studies have investigated that. This is hypertrophy, how many studies, and forget about jump and sprinting speed. There's only 3 or 4 studies. We can't say anything about that. But overall, when you look at the effects of these studies, it seems that some of the well-performed studies in athletic populations does seem to lead to greater maximal strength, as I've shown you in our studies. Power I'm a bit more convinced about. There's only a couple of studies which really seem to have some kind of overlap. That seems convincing. Hypertrophy, this is kind of my standpoint. I'm not convinced. Do you get any greater hypertrophy from using eccentric overload? But again, if you're a sports science student, the meta-analysis is the first step. The second step is to go in each and every one of these studies and look at the methods. Who were the subjects? What was the training program? How did they control the various factors to get their results? But overall, I would say for maximal strength and for power, it could be promising. And you can definitely try it in your athletes, in your subjects. It seems to acutely enhance the power production that we saw, which will lead to greater gains in power. It definitely produces the greater neuromuscular fatigue. We saw that as well. You've recovered, Niels? You're looking good? Great. And then it really probably leads to greater increases in maximum strength through neural mechanisms, not hypertrophy, I would say. These are my collaborators who worked in that study with me, so I thank those academics, and I thank you all for staying with me until the end.